We're in the office of Saul Perlmuller at UMass Hillel, and I will ask you to start out, if you don't mind, by telling a little bit about where you grew up, a little bit about your parents, your family background, your grandparents, as far back as you can go in terms of family history, because I'm always curious about that. I can hold it.
Okay. I'd rather if I move around.
Okay, if you're comfortable.
Yeah. I grew up in Burlington, Vermont, born in 1948. My great uncle landed there first and opened a mattress factory there and a furniture business. And then my grandfather came and worked in the business. Then my father came and also worked in that business. My father, not being the son of that was my maternal grandfather. Mm-hmm. And my dad was not from that side, although actually my dad and my mother were related, but that's another story, as many folks. So anyways, he worked there for a while, and then he opened his own business. So that's what got us to Burlington. Probably there was some peddler who first ended up there. I don't quite know that, but started from my grandparents' generation, my family in Burlington.
So the 1920s or something like that?
I'm not exactly sure when my mother and her family came. My great uncle probably came in the 20s or 30s. My dad only arrived in this country in the early 1920s. Yeah, he probably came, he was in Boston for a while, and then probably came around the either late 20s or early 30s. I'm not sure exactly when he made it to Burlington.
Yeah. You can just keep it on yourself.
Okay.
And where had they come from?
Well, my mother was born in Boston. Her parents came from Eastern Europe. Mm-hmm. When my mother went to kindergarten, she was still speaking only Yiddish, even though she was born in Boston. My dad came from Eastern Europe, from what was then Poland. Later it became Ukraine. He is actually related to my mother's mother.
That's the connection.
That's the connection. And my dad and my mother are actually of different generations. So when my dad came to Burlington, he actually lived in my mother's home, his cousin's home. Mm-hmm. So, and he was 10 years older than my mother, and at first, she didn't even want to kiss this cousin who arrived, kind of thing. I think she was 12 and he was 22 or something like that when he first arrived there, something like that. Well, actually, that would help figure it out. So that if that's correct, then it would have been in the 1920s.
Were they and were their parents and background fairly religiously observant?
Yeah, my mother's parents, especially my mother's father, was very religiously observant. I remember as a kid, sometimes he would walk to the corner of a room and daven mincha or something like that. So yes, he was quite religiously observant. My dad's father was. My dad hardly knew his father, so there wasn't much of a question there. But he went to cheder and stuff in Eastern Europe, and his mother, I think, was fairly traditionally observant.
Mm-hmm. So now, when they came, they eventually ended up in Burlington. Were they? You said, maybe there was a peddler or something like that, but I assume they weren't the only Jewish family there, although I don't guess there were
Correct.
Many.
Correct.
What was the community like, at least as you heard
when they arrived?
From them, yeah.
I'm going to just pull this a little bit more if I can.
Yeah. Sure, I've got a tight leash.
Thanks. I'm not sure exactly when they arrived. I know that there was a Talmud Torah. I know that there was an old-time Orthodox synagogue that had been there for many years. I think the conservative synagogue, when I was a kid, was celebrating either 50 or 75 years of its history. So there already was a community, and there'd already at least one synagogue building when they arrived as well.
And either recalling, what you might have heard from them or just from your own growing up, were most of the Jewish people around employed in the sort of thing, retail?
Yeah.
Was that the case across the board? Or
I think early on they were largely merchants.
Yeah, maybe you could give sort of just a list of families and businesses that occurred.
Okay. By the way, for Burlington, there's the longtime rabbi of Burlington is Rabbi Max Wall, who is still around.
Yeah.
And if he would be in terms of, he would be much better than me in terms of the community as a whole.
Yeah, that's always my last question.
Okay.
Who else I should talk to?
Okay. So anyway, there was the Harris family that owned a clothing store. There was Megram's, which was a clothing store. There was Passacow, who owned a clothing store. I'm just thinking of some that I remember as a kid. And I left when I was 18, basically, or 16 to go to college, and haven't lived there since. But what other? Some people owned apartments. My dad owned some apartments. There was the junk shop. Samuelson family owned scrap metal. There were some grocery stores that were owned by Jews. Kolodny owned a store. Sager, I think, owned a store. Wholesale food or whatever. There was Sam Epstein had a little market in Winooski. Those are just some that come up.
Was there an actual neighborhood? I mean, by the time you came along, were these people clustered together geographically? Or?
I think there was more of a neighborhood more than when I came around. Less so when I was a kid. And there were places where there'd be more Jews or fewer Jews, but not a real neighborhood where everyone was Jewish.
Yeah. And so you say there was a pre-existing Orthodox synagogue, and then somewhere along the line, people created another.
Yeah, I think that the conservative must have come after the Orthodox. I think I'm not 100% sure because this was really before my time.
Yeah. So well, in any case, which one did you?
So my grandfather belonged to the Orthodox shul. My family went to the conservative shul. And we lived actually right around the corner from it. When I was late for Hebrew school, I could cut through the woods behind my house and just run there in, a minute or two or something like that.
So, and I take it you went through the whole, the Hebrew school.
Yeah, I did. I went through Hebrew school. It was an afternoon Hebrew school. But they even had something that went all the way through high school, through 12th grade, which for Burlington, Vermont ain't bad. And I went through that.
Yeah. Were a lot of your classmates in Hebrew school also attending I'm assuming you went to a public school?
Yes, I went to public school.
Yeah. So how many Jewish kids were in your public school environment? Would you be the only one running
No.
school?
Well, by senior year of high school, there were maybe a small number of kids in our class, and I was cutting a fair amount. But no, I don't know. In the younger grades, there were maybe 15 kids or 10 or 20 kids. I mean, I was never like the only kid in my public school class, the only Jewish kid. Never. There were always several.
I guess both for you and for your family in general. You have to excuse me. This is a bad allergy.
Oh, sorry about that.
I start crying.
Okay, it's not any. Yeah.
I'm curious to know just the general atmosphere that you experienced as a Jewish person living in a community that was, obviously predominantly not Jewish.
Right. I was very comfortable as growing up Jewish in Burlington. We had a youth group, a Jewish youth group that was very good and very strong. That was like, an important part of my social life. But also, many of my closest friends some were Jews, some were not Jews. Closest friends, both. And, our friendship group was a mixed group of Jews and non-Jews, and there was a lot of respect among our peers around that stuff. I remember the Six-Day War period vividly, and talking with some of my non-Jewish friends and their sympathy and stuff. So I really didn't experience any anti-Semitism that I can remember as a kid in Burlington. Now, my oldest brother, who is 10 years older than me, there are family stories about he started coming home real late from school. And so my parents asked him why, and he said, well, I walked this way. Well, why did you walk this long way around? Well, because there was some guy bullying him or whatever, because he was a Jew. So the story is my dad followed him one day, and I guess, threatened to beat the crap out of the kid or something, and that ended the issues. But so anyways, it's not like there was no anti-Semitism there, and that some members of my family experienced it, but I didn't.
Yeah. So maybe, it sounds like maybe it was something generational.
Yeah, a bit. And also maybe the neighborhood. By that we had moved to a different neighborhood. I was going to a different school, so that may have made a little bit of a difference too.
Was your that neighborhood? I've been to Burlington a few times. It's obviously not quite urban, but it's not rural either.
Right.
What sort of living environment was it? Was it sort of a suburban type? How would you describe it, just geographically, with houses close together, far apart?
Well, I lived on the last house on the left of a dead-end street, and the houses they weren't like attached houses or anything like that, which would be more urban. They were all separate frame houses. Mm-hmm. On our street, we probably had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 houses or something like that. Mm-hmm. I guess more suburban than. There was grass, right. Not huge lawns, but some grass to mow.
Now, I take it. This is kind of.
But there was a farm, I went down a hill and another hill, and there'd be farm animals and stuff if I wanted to.
Okay, that's kind of what I was thinking, and in the back of my head might be true. I take it that, growing up Jewish in a place like Vermont, even if it's in the big city in Vermont, is different from growing up Jewish, say, in New Jersey.
Sure, I would think that's true.
As you think back on it now, what made it different? And, whether those are positive or negative.
Well, for one thing, clearly a mixed group of friends, I was telling you before, both Jews and non-Jews. Secondly, there was no kosher restaurant. Well, there were kosher butchers and stuff when I grew up. There were 2 kosher butchers even. So, I guess there's also a difference between growing up in Burlington and other parts of Vermont, definitely. It's a good question. It's not an easy one to answer.
I guess I'm wondering, for example, I assume that most of the students who come here probably didn't grow up in places like Burlington.
Probably.
And you have interaction. What do you think that perhaps that they got as Jews growing up in this culture that you didn't, and what did you get that they missed out on?
Yeah. Ironically, because I grew up in a smaller place, but with a decent number of Jews, I had a very rich, Jewish youth group experience, and even a semi-decent Jewish education, especially for, the boonies. Mm-hmm. I think sometimes people who grow up, say, in Newton or some place where there are a lot of Jews, maybe their parents don't send them to Jewish education or make as much of a big deal about them being part of a youth group because their peer group is largely Jewish. I'm talking about from large Jewish neighborhoods or Brookline or something like that. So, ironically, we may have had a stronger youth group in Burlington, Vermont than they have in some places, at least today, in some cities where there are more Jews. I think that's one maybe unanticipated difference. Other differences. Well, Yiddish was around. My grandparents spoke Yiddish most of the time. I heard Yiddish. I think this isn't a Vermont city. This is an age thing. So, but I heard Yiddish frequently. That would be a different thing. I'm not sure. There are probably other things too. I'm not putting my finger on.
Well, let's put it this way: what kinds of things do you think you did as a Vermonter growing up? I mean, in what ways did your family sort of take advantage of?
Oh, there was a lake nearby. There was a lake named Lake Champlain. We spent a lot of time at the beach. So there would be family outings at the beach. We would do that. Our family would go spend a whole day there, bring a lunch sometimes, do that kind of thing. As a kid, I went hiking with friends, overnight hikes, several day hikes sometimes. That was something that I might not have done if I'd grown up in the city. Actually, there's one story, our youth group, our young Judea group, when I think I was a freshman in high school, my brother I think was a senior, we're going on a overnight hike as part of a Young Judea thing to the Green Mountains, to Mount Mansfield or whatever. And some parents said, well, what about adult supervision? And I said, well, there's a youth group leader. And someone said, no, that's a college kid. What about adult supervision? So, and they were threatening to, if there's not adult supervision, we're not sending our daughter, and shouldn't do it. So my parents volunteered to be the adult supervision. My dad had a station wagon, and he was in the mattress business. So he made a little, polyfoam mattress to fit the back of the station wagon. And my mother and dad went up there and slept in the car and were the adult, chaperones, as it were. What's so funny about this thing is that the last place my mother would have wanted to be is in the woods. Every time I used to go hiking as a kid, she'd say, aren't you afraid of the bears, and aren't you afraid of... But, kol hakavod, they... rather than have this thing canceled, they did it. So that's sort of a Vermont, twist to our youth group thing, anyways.
Yeah. Did your family, you said there was some space around the house. Did your family garden?
My dad in later life had a little garden, but it wasn't a big thing. I think at one point he had a little cask and tried to make some of his own wine, I remember. In the back of our house, there were what we called the woods. It was an area we didn't own, but it was an area as kids, we used to play baseball back there and hide and seek back there, and, that was a lot of outdoor stuff. And on our street, because it was a dead-end street, we would play hide and seek, all the kids on the street, nights in the summer and other kind of games like that. That was... do that all the time.
Now, did you said, I think that, after, I forget, you were 16 or 18 or something, you left. You went...
I went to college, yeah.
Did you go far away?
I went to Brandeis.
Okay, not that far.
Yeah.
Is your family or parts of your family still up there?
I have a cousin who now lives in Burlington, but in terms of the people who grew up in Burlington, practically no. My brothers bought a summer place on a lake on Lake Champlain, not right in Burlington, but so they go up some summers, and I still go up some summers. Well, here's another little story. I remember one Thanksgiving when I came home for Thanksgiving from Brandeis. I drove home, probably my senior year probably, and it started to snow, and snowed nonstop all of Thanksgiving. So by the time I was ready to go back to Brandeis, they never were able to plow the street because they couldn't even plow the major streets. Barely could keep up with it. So I started shoveling on our end, which was the far end of our dead-end street, and various neighbors came out, and all of us managed to shovel a path for one car out the street, so we could at least get it out. So anyways, that's just, there's a rural Vermont story. Yeah.
Was it somewhat of a pattern for people, say, of your generation to, let's say grow up there and then go to school somewhere else? And
often, although some
not
people went to,
necessarily come back?
often, but some people went to University of Vermont, which was in Burlington.
Yeah.
But oftentimes people would
Yeah.
go away, but not everybody.
Now, if we skip ahead, you don't have to go through your whole.
But let me say one more thing
sure,
about.
Of course.
There was a thing called Vermont Jewish Youth Council, VJYC, which was also a kind of, in terms of different. I don't know if in a New Jersey or a place where there are a lot of Jews, there would have ever been a statewide Jewish youth organization, but there was in Vermont. And it was especially needed, not so much for Burlington, which had a synagogue and had a youth group, and even not so much for Rutland, which had a synagogue. But most of there were hardly any other synagogues. Maybe Bennington had a little one when I was growing up. But anyways, so they would have, I think, conferences a year, one in Burlington and one in Rutland. Kids, high school kids, whatever, would go, and there would be some social stuff and some religious stuff and some cultural stuff, and that was probably unique to Burlington, to Vermont, or maybe to a few other states like that. And I remember I would meet kids from St. Johnsbury and Moncton. I didn't even know there were Jews. I hadn't even heard of Moncton and other places like that. This kind of thing. So that is something you might want to.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I actually, I was. In doing this project, I've tried to read about the Jewish experience in other regions of the country, and I read a really interesting article about Southern Jewish wedding customs, as sort of distinct from Jewish wedding customs and Southern wedding, sort of an amalgam. And one of the things that was pointed out in there is that because Southern Jews constitute a fairly close-knit group, despite the fact that there are hundreds of miles between them.
Yeah.
And so, let's say a family in Baton Rouge, routinely will get together. Cousins in Atlanta.
Interesting.
And, their relatives in Houston, and so these, as you're describing this sort of regional wide opportunities for people to get together.
Yeah.
I guess I was going to ask just about moving forward into the fact that you live. This isn't Burlington, Vermont, but it's still relatively rural as at least just Jewish experiences go. Did you choose to come to UMass Hillel because it was in also in sort of a rural New England? Was that did that figure as part of your?
I was not looking to go to a big city. And my wife had got accepted at Smith Social Work School. This job came available like 2 weeks after she got accepted. Her family at that point was in the Boston area. My family was still in the Burlington area. This was right in the middle. So both, because it was familiar in terms of, actually Northampton reminded me a lot of Burlington. College town, not big city, countryside around, and close to family, but not immediately in family. So all of those things were factored, and job stuff that opened it.
And how long have you been?
About 30 years.
Wow.
I got here in '74, August of '74.
So I think I remember you saying you have kids.
Yes.
That they grew up here.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what was that experience? I guess I'm asking sort of the same thing that I've asked about you. For them growing up in Western Mass. How was their Jewish experience distinct, do you think?
Well, they also were part of the local synagogue, although we also are part of a chavurah that exists totally outside of a synagogue. Many of us are members of synagogues, but it's not formally connected with any other organization. I live in Northampton. There's some of the folks in our chavurah from Amherst, some from Northampton. That was an important part of their growing up as Jewish kids here. We would get together for services about every 2 weeks usually. And so that was kind of unique. It doesn't have to be unique to a rural area. There are also chavurot in urban areas, but that was really nice for them, I think. Gave them like an extended Jewish family in the area. They were part of youth groups. They went to Jewish summer camps. I went to Jewish summer camps. mixture of Jewish and non-Jewish friends, close friends, both. In a way, I think most of my son's friends are not Jewish, actually. My daughter, probably more even mix. But maybe it's more even for both of them. But, clearly close friends of both Jewish and non-Jewish. So, I think that's...
Yeah.
We spent a year in Israel, a sabbatical year when my daughter turned 7 and my son turned 3, I guess. Mm-hmm. And that was a major... my family never did anything like that when I was growing up.
Yeah. Do you feel like, having grown up in Vermont and lived here, for so long, do you feel like you've inherited some kind of New England traits? When you think about yourself as a New England person, what does that mean, or does it mean anything to you?
The first thing that I was smiling when you asked the question, a friend of mine, when I was growing up, his family had it used to be a one-room schoolhouse in Lincoln, Vermont, and he was one of my friends, and we would sometimes go there use it as a base for hiking or hang out. And people in Lincoln, if you're driving and you say hello, you just sort of lift a finger off the steering wheel and put it back. That's saying hello. So kind of this understated Vermont kind of stuff. So there's pieces of me I kind of like. I know if I'm in Lincoln, if I want to wave to someone, I know how to wave to someone, which would be very different than how I'd wave to someone in a different city. So there are just pieces of me that know that Vermont stuff and feel comfortable around the Vermont twang and this kind of thing. But so that's just a little kind of thing, but that's not really answering your question. So
no, it actually, I don't know. It made me think. I have a neighbor, same thing. I'm just thinking about it now. That's how we wave to each other. We never thought about it before.
I think maybe, I don't know if it's my personality or my whatever, not to make too big a deal of things publicly or whatever, but that just, maybe I'm a little more reserved in some ways, I think. So, but it's hard for me to say what's New England in me and what's just me and what does New England really mean anyways.
Yeah.
Don't like to ask too much of people. If I'm asking for something for Hillel, that's one thing. But personally, I don't like to ask, favors too much or stuff like that. Again, I don't know if that's me or that's New England.
Right. Just that idea of sort of self-sufficiency, I guess.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. And I really, it's important for me to be physically active. I bike a lot to work, for example. Now, is this New England? Is this whatever? Who knows? But I like being. I don't like, for example, exercising in a gym. I love to exercise. I love to be outside. I grew up a lot outside. So I bike a lot to work. Even today I biked from Florence. It's about 11 miles one way. Do that a lot. I used to, after work in the summers when I was a kid, high school kid, I'd go for a swim in the lake at a friend of mine who had a place on the lake. So very outdoors and still liking the outdoors, and that's where I get my exercise. To go schwitz in a gym is just not my idea of fun.
Yeah, same here. Now this is it's a related but not directly related question, and it really, I guess I'm just calling upon your sense of your Judaism here. But how important for you in your practice of Judaism and of Jewish culture is place? Does it matter where one is? Is that part of the the sacred experience, or?
I don't know. I sometimes when I would go back to the synagogue in Burlington, if I might be up there, this is after I'd moved away and whatever, there'd be a certain sense of warmth or community, but I think that's out of childhood nostalgia. I was up there a year or so ago, and because most of the people by then I didn't know, it didn't, I could remember Mr. Weedman used to sit here and Mr. this there, but it's starting to, I was starting to feel more as a stranger and an outsider. Mm-hmm. Even though, people were reasonably warm, but there were plenty of people who had Perlmuller family. I hadn't, whereas obviously we were part of the community integrally earlier. So I don't think place is that critical for me. Chavurah meets in different people's homes. I can be outside and have a wonderful service outdoors. I don't think I'm that tied to place.
When you go back to Burlington, as you're describing, it sounds like, the demography of the Jewish situation is very different. I mean, there may very well be as many, if not more, Jews now, but they're doing different things, right?
Or I don't know them. I'm guessing there's still some merchants, but they're probably a lot more professionals now. I can't claim to know the community that well anymore. By the way, one thing, I'm going to have to stop pretty soon. I don't know how.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm fine with that.
Okay.
I've got to pick my daughter up.
A number of years ago, while I was here, I was invited to speak at the Brattleboro Jewish community.
Yeah.
About issues of anti-Semitism and stuff. The topic's not important. But so there were about, I think, maybe 30 people in the room. So I decided to first ask people just to introduce themselves and where they were from. And this one's New York, this one's New Jersey, this one's Delaware. Myself and one other guy were the only Vermonters in the room. Mm-hmm. So it's just interesting that a lot of, at least in some places, Jewish life and organizational life, people who are involved in it, at least in that one experience, hardly anyone actually had grown up in Vermont. Mm-hmm. A fair number of people had, moved to Vermont.
Yeah.
I don't know what the case is with other places in Vermont, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's also not uncommon.
Well, that's certainly what I've found in my very limited cross-section of people I've talked to. I had an interview, I guess, a week and a half ago with an elderly couple that helped to start the conference on Judaism in rural New England. Yeah. Came there from Chicago.
Right, right.
And that's very typical.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much.
You're very welcome.
Appreciate it.
Sure.